Alright guys, let's talk episode 3 of Dune Prophecy. This is going to be our full spoiler discussion, so if you have not seen episode 3 of Dune Prophecy, just make sure to save this video, this segment, this podcast for later, and come back once you have. It is going to be full of spoilers for the episode. Like I've been saying, I've been stalling for just a few more seconds. I'm going to be stalling for a few more seconds, so if you haven't seen it, then make sure to click off and come back. And without further ado, let's talk about the third episode of this show. So, as I always like to do with these spoiler discussions, just want to give a quick recap of my thoughts on the previous episodes, just in case you guys are new to the channel or new to this series. So the first couple episodes, I think we're really good, really solid, I should say. And I say this with the caveat of a couple things. Number one, and I think this correlates to episode 1, the first episode, the premiere, was a little bit slow because I think it was setting up things and it was building towards a lot of other, parts, a lot of other aspects, a lot of other subplots and payoffs that hopefully will be coming down the line. The second episode, I think, then pointed to the other reality of the show that I pointed out in the last spoiler discussion, which is that I don't think this is a show for everybody. And what I mean by that is that, and this was a very common refrain that came out of the first reactions to the show, and I was curious to see what that meant, but I think I understand that a lot better now, is that this show is, it's complicated, but I don't mean that in a sort of condescending way of like, oh, if you don't understand it, it's too complicated for you. No, I mean, I think it's complicated for just about everyone. And I think what I mean by that just not being for everyone is just that you have to be really invested in this world. You have to be really invested in the Dune lore. You have to be really invested in these characters. And if you're not, totally fine. But I just don't think that the show is for you at that point, and that's totally okay. I just think that it kind of, your mileage may vary based on how you see those first two episodes. So I think that is that's sort of where I was approaching it. But I, as somebody who really enjoys the Dune films and who enjoys the Dune lore, I read Dune and I read Dune Messiah. I enjoy those books very much, and the world that Frank Herbert has made. I think that this show has been very solid thus far. Now, like I said in my immediate reaction that I posted right after watching the episode, I don't think this episode was particularly strong, actually. I think that this was, easily the weakest episode out of the 3, and I think that it had some pretty significant problems. Now, I did also say, we're going to talk about this as I do a little bit of a play-by-play through the episode and talk through some of my thoughts of the major moments, but I think the first 3/4 of this episode were a little shaky to me, because I think that they were just going through a lot of different things very quickly and cutting back and forth between past and present in a way that just didn't feel purposeful. It just kind of felt like, oh, we're just doing this because jumping back and forth and showing you this and that. And then I think finally in the last maybe 10 or 15 minutes, things started to tie together. But then we ended on now I can say this in the spoiler discussion, they ended on Lila being kept alive. And I was like, well, no, I am more interested in the house wars. I'm more interested in how the Reverend Mothers are and the sisterhood are manipulating the houses. I'm more interested in the Princess Inez and how she's going to factor into the Bene Gesserit's plan. And most of all, after episode 2, I'm most interested in Desmond Hart and his clash with Valia Harkonnen. And so, the fact that we're now focusing in a little bit more, at least on this keeping Lila alive, is maybe not as interesting to me. However, I fully admit that, I don't even know where it's going to go in episode 4. So perhaps it might all tie together very nicely. Maybe she has something more to say about Desmond Hart, and, we'll see. But let's go through episode 3 and talk about this episode before we get into anything else. So we start out here in a flashback sequence. We're on a snow planet. I forget, it's Lankavale or something like that. That's the planet that Valia and the rest of the Harkonnen crew are hanging out on. And so I thought at first, okay, is this going to be a full-on flashback episode, a la episode 4 of The Penguin? Turns out not so much. I might have even preferred if this was just a full-on flashback episode, though I think I understand, because this show, like I had said in the immediate reaction, is condensed into 6 episodes. I say condensed because most of the other shows that we've been watching, especially on HBO, have been 8 episodes, right? The Penguin was 8 episodes, and I think that worked a little bit better. Agatha All Along was 9 episodes. This show is 6 episodes, which is, I feel like this episode was the first time you kind of felt that rush going through it, right? You felt like they were kind of trying to rush the pacing just a little bit. But I thought this was going to be a full flashback episode of Tula and Valia, and it was setting up, the distrust and the beef between the Atreides and the Harkonnens immediately because of this whole, I'm not going to say subplot, but the storyline with Griffin Harkonnen being murdered by Vorian Atreides. His name is Vorian Atreides. Now, actually, we'll get to that later. I have some confessions to make about this whole Vorian story subplot, but we'll get to that later. So Valia, at the very beginning, I mean, even early on, she has a lot of ambition, and it's very clear. I think this is one of the things that these flashbacks are setting up, is the fact that she has a lot of drive, a lot of rage, and a lot of ambition. I mean, it seems like she is the person where the voice originates from that all the Reverend Mothers use. Ironically, when Jessica Atreides becomes the Reverend Mother later on in Dune, I mean, she's an Atreides, but she's using the voice. And I think that that's kind of ironic. Obviously, 10,000 years later, but still, just some kind of irony there. So they get into this whole backstory of how Griffin Harkonnen dies. And this is sort of building up the backstory of Alia Harkonnen. And it feels rushed, because I think that they wanted to set up the fact that, you don't see Vorian Harkonnen, obviously, because he comes into play much later, or not much later, almost immediately after this, and you don't want to see him because of the whole reveal that Ori is, the guy who killed Griffin and whatnot. But it felt kind of weird and stilted and rushed that you jump from, Valia and Griffin talking together, and then the next scene is, oh, he's dead, and, Valia is all, upset about that. And rightfully so, obviously, but, you see that rage coming up. But it felt like they were just trying to rush through some of these story beats. I also thought they could have spent a little bit more time on this snow planet, Lonkavale. I'm going to say Lonkavale until someone corrects me. I could be totally wrong. But, they could have spent a little bit more time on this planet, just exploring it and how miserable their lives are. I would have liked to have seen a little bit more depth in spending time with these characters, the Harkonnens, because it just didn't really connect with me. I think Valia the young Valia, I should say, was beginning to connect with me, throughout the episode. And I think the Tula storyline was really the strongest one. And I think that they should have leaned into that more, which I think they tried to, but, they had to pull back into the present every once in a while, which I think really jarred the momentum that this flashback sequence was going into. So anyways, we get this backstory now that Vorian murdered Griffin, and then we are kind of heading back into present day now. And so, we talk about, they're talking about the prophecy, because obviously it's Dune prophecy. And apparently Raquella spoke that prophecy, and she said something like born twice, one out of blood and one out of spice, or something like that. And they think it's about Desmond Hart. So, that's great. That's really interesting. What about it? And then we never find out in this episode. I'm sure we're going to find out in episode 4, but I think that is interesting. Also, we get hints that Lila is in some kind of coma at the beginning, but then this whole thing about, Tula having to let her go, but apparently she just doesn't let her go at the end, which I think is interesting. We'll see where that goes. I think the older woman, the older sister, is a little bit, I don't know, she comes off as so condescending towards Tula, and I maybe that's the point, but I was like, wow. I mean, just let Tula be in her feelings. I understand that, the Bene Gesserit are very much not in tune, or not in tune, what's the right word? Not, receptive to expressing their emotions, as it's very kind of Jedi-like I mentioned in the last episode, of very monk, monastery nuns kind of things. But, I still think that this older sister was like, maybe back off a little bit, maybe because Tula is going through it. But anyways, so then we flash back to Tula, and now she has a love interest. And so this is where I have to confess, and maybe I was tired when I watched the episode. I watched it right when it came out, and in the evening, Sunday evening, and I don't know. Maybe this was exceedingly obvious to everyone. First of all, I was not cognizant of the fact that these were Atreides until they started chanting Atreides, and then I was like, oh, wait a second. That was much later. That was much, 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 much later. That was after Ori had proposed to Tula. So I was like, oh, Atreides. Is this guy an Atreides? And then, his name is Ori, and I was kind of like, maybe just some random other Harkonnen. It never once occurred to me that the Ori is a nickname for Vorian, and that's so dumb of me. That is so silly of me. I should have gotten it, and maybe the intention was, I'm assuming that that's what happened, right? Because that's why she killed her. Anyways, I just didn't put pieces together, and I really should have. But again, like my confession, a lot of what I was talking about here in these notes, and I'm not going to rehash all of them. It's just me being confused about like, why are we cutting back to this guy? And then when she kills him, I'm like, what? And then eventually I understood, and I was like, oh, okay, this all makes sense. So just wanted to, kind of give my own experience of what I was thinking through this episode. I don't think it's the episode's fault. I just think I was not paying attention to the right things, or not looking for the Vorian thing. And if that was, the intention, then good job, I guess, to the show, because yeah. But I also think that, regardless of all of that, it makes it, I think the scenes here where Tula is healing the horse and all that kind of stuff, it feels, the point here is that Tula felt kind of abandoned, or maybe that was all a ruse as well, but at least for the front-facing part, Tula felt abandoned by her own family, and so now she's with, the Atreides, but I think it all was a double cross eventually. But I think these parts where she's just healing the horse and whatnot, it's just kind of her, it's kind of this image of this facade of her being like, I'm living a different life now, and I'm not part of the Harkonnens anymore. It just felt a little slow. It's like, okay, Ori's horse died, and now Tula's healing the horse, and now it's like, I mean, I get it on the one hand, but also I, was kind of hoping the episode could have been moving a little bit faster is all. And I think that, at this point I was feeling the episode's disjointedness a little bit more, just cutting back and forth between the present, cutting back and forth between different childhoods. So you have Valia, and you have Tula, and you have the present Tula, and you have the past Tula. And I don't think it's the fact that they were cutting back and forth that was the problem. I just think that it's the fact that none of it felt quite as connected together as I had hoped. And I think that was really one of the bigger gripes that I had with the beginning of the episode. I think it's interesting, though, to see that Tula was sort of the forgotten child. I think that that's interesting backstory, and I hope that plays in. I hope that there is some kind of, verbal confrontation between Tula and Valia later on. And so then we get this scene now where, again, adult show, family-friendly channel, not going to talk about it too much, but Tula and Ori are getting married, so supposedly, and then, as they're, in each other's company, you see outside that they, the other people are chanting Atreides, and I was like, oh, how interesting. And then, once Tula starts revealing her backstory, I was like, oh, I get it. And so that, this is the point. I think it was about 15 minutes left in the episode, and I was like, I get now why they were setting up the things that they were setting up, but I still maintain that the show felt, or this episode rather, felt a little bit all over the place, and just in terms of where they were going, and it felt rushed. I mean, I think that this episode, or these storylines, in themselves could have easily been stretched out into a couple episodes if you're not going to dedicate an entire flashback episode to all this stuff, and you're going to still be back and forth in the present, even though I think the present bits in this episode were not really that interesting, because they were just almost like little reminders of, hey, we're still here, remember us, we're the important part of the show. And I was like, no, I know that, but I'm watching this flashback and I'm thinking this flashback is important. So anyways, but I did really enjoy this, in isolation, again, this little mini Tula storyline where she has to go through this thing where she has to kill all the Atreides and she has to kill Ori, even though I think it's clear that she did fall in love with him, or at least, caught feelings for him, which I think is, again, tragic. I think that, the writing for that character is really good. I just think that in the context of this episode, it felt a little bit, not out of place per se, but just, the way that they cut all this together, it just felt a little bit, disjointed. I keep using that word, but I think it's a word that's appropriate for this episode. So yeah, the entire Atreides family in that area is dead, which is crazy. It's really scary. And I also wonder, and maybe you guys know in the comments, maybe again this is just me not paying attention enough, but the boy that Tula lets go after all the Atreides are dead, do we know if that's somebody important? I have a couple guesses as to who that might be later on, because it seemed very intentional that the camera lingered on that boy and then she let him go. We'll see. I have some guesses, but who knows? We'll see from there. So we then get back to Valia and her origin story, and this is the origin story of the voice. I guess this is how she develops the voice that becomes the signature stamp of the Reverend Mothers, and then she walks out of the agony, and then she heads home, and she almost kills, I think, is that her mother that she tells to hold the knife up? But she's defending Tula, which I think is, I think that that's where the bond between the sisters is forming. Although I do see some tension between these two sisters, obviously in the backstory as well. I think that Valia's ambition is getting the better of her, has gotten the better of her in the past, and I wonder where Tula fits into all of this, especially the fact that at the very end of the episode we see her disobeying Valia, pretty explicitly by keeping Lila alive. I don't know, who knows what Valia would have thought, but she says something like, well, Valia isn't here, is she? So continue the protocol and keep this child alive. And then Valia, at the end of the episode, right before that I should say, Valia goes and meets some people, and one of the guys calls her aunt. Again, who are these people? Were they in the earlier scenes with the family? They could easily have been. But I again, just setting up some things for the future that I'm like, maybe, interesting. She seems to think it's a desperation kind of play. But I'd like to start seeing where all of this is fitting together now. Because here's the thing, right? As we wrap up this spoiler discussion, this is not episode 3 of 8. And if this was episode 3 of 8, I might have been like a little bit more forgiving of this episode. Not that I hated the episode. I didn't dislike it even that much. I just thought it was a little weak, is what I will say. Because again, everything that I saw pretty much in isolation, I thought was good. I just think that this episode put together was not as strong as the other two episodes. But the reason that I might be a little bit, I might be a little bit more harsh on this episode is because I think that when you have only 6 episodes, we are now at the halfway point, and it really feels like we're still just ramping up. The last 3 episodes could be crazy and could have all these things coming together, but I still don't have a good sense of Desmond Hart. I have a decent sense of Valia and Tula, but then other storylines like, you know, the younger sisters, you know, the I guess, yeah, the student sisters, I should say. You know, what are they thinking? Because we keep, you know, jumping back to them every once in a while in the present. Also, Inez, we didn't see her at all in this episode, which is fine if not for the fact that this is the halfway point of the series. You know, Kira and Atreides and the rebellion. We have other stuff going on, obviously, with Desmond Hart and the Emperor, the Carrinos. And so I just think that, you know, I'm not necessarily off the Dune prophecy train. I think, on the contrary, I'm still very much invested in this storyline. I'm just maybe a little bit more cautious and a little bit more worried about where the show is going in terms of its pacing, because by the time episode 3, or rather the 50% mark, is hit, you should be probably gearing up for, you know, this second half pivot where, you know, things are going to change and pieces are going to move. And at this point, I'm still feeling like we're towards the end of Act 1, if that makes sense. So again, maybe the next 3 episodes are going to change my entire perception of that, but we'll have to see about that. Guys, what did you think of episode 3 of Dune Prophecy? Do you think it is the best episode, the worst episode, or maybe it's in the middle? Let me know in the comments down below. And are you excited for the second half of the season? Let me know in the comments down below.